Hey YouTubers, this is the Gold Standard Caesar 924 coming at you with another video for you guys today. With SummerSlam coming around this coming Sunday, I just figured I'd take this time to compile a list of some of my personal favorite SummerSlam matches to have taken place throughout the years. So for this video and the next video, this is going to pertain to some of my top 10 favorite SummerSlam matches of each decade. So in this video, this is going to be my top 10 list of my favorite matches of the 1990s. And the next video is going to be my top 10 favorite SummerSlam matches to have taken place in the 2000s. Now, I was going to do another one with the 2010s, but that decade hasn't finished yet. And I just decided to just basically discard that. Before I get started with this list, I'm going to basically make note of some honorable mentions that aren't included in my countdown list of the favorite matches of the 1990s. Now, these honorable mentions include Razor Ramon versus Diesel from SummerSlam 1994, the hair versus hair match between X-Pac and Jeff Jarrett from SummerSlam 1998, the Intercontinental title defense with Owen Hart defending the belt against Stone Cold at SummerSlam 1997, Shawn Michaels versus Vader for the WWF title in SummerSlam 1996, and the WWF title bout between Undertaker versus Bret Hart from SummerSlam 1997. So without further ado, this will be my top 10 favorite SummerSlam matches of the years 1990 to 1999. So at number 10, to kind of start off this video, is the street fight between Test and Shane McMahon, and this was from the year of 1999. Now, I basically did a whole review of SummerSlam 1999, so if you haven't checked out that video already, check it out whenever you have the chance. But I basically talked a brief bit about that match, and I'm not necessarily going to reiterate too much, but basically, this was a match that surprisingly I really enjoyed, and it's one of those matches that doesn't really get talked about a whole lot, especially since this was a match that didn't involve any of the particular key figured wrestlers of the Attitude Era, like Stone Cold, Rock, Triple H. Test was really over in the WWE at the time. He was still mid-Carter, but I mean, he was involved in some pretty big storylines, especially being part of the corporation alongside Shane and Vince McMahon. And then at some point along the way, Test gets kicked out of the corporation, and thus starting up the corporate ministry versus the union that went on for a little while. Also throughout that summer, Test started going out with Stephanie around this time, much to the chagrin of her brother Shane. The build-up having that if Shane McMahon won, then Test could no longer see or date Stephanie ever again. But if Test won, then Shane would agree to offer his blessings to both Test and Stephanie McMahon. And we basically get to see what you'd expect for a street fight with a lot of weapon usage and just a lot of brawling outside. Just a lot of good stuff, and the spot fest as well, with Shane McMahon doing that diving elbow drop to Test through the announce table. Yeah, this was basically the highlight of Test's wrestling career. And, Test would eventually beat Shane McMahon in that match. And Test would, not a little long after this, that Test and Stephanie both agreed to the wedding. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this. And it's just quite a shame that it doesn't really get the credit that it deserves. Number 9, this is the IC title ladder match. Now, there have been 2 ladder matches at SummerSlam during that decade. From the new generation era is the ladder match for the Intercontinental Championship between the champion HBK defending the belt against Razor Ramon. Now, a lot of people associate this match from their original ladder match encounter at WrestleMania 10. But they do happen to have a rematch here just about a year and a half later at SummerSlam 95. Now, this was actually pretty interesting because there wasn't really a whole lot of build between HBK versus Razor. It was something that just kind of happened out of the blue. Now, originally, Shawn Michaels was supposed to take on Sid Vicious on this pay-per-view, but eventually they did a bait and switch, so they had HBK take on Razor Ramon instead. Now, this was actually a pretty enjoyable match. I mean, it wasn't as memorable compared to WrestleMania 10. Shawn Michaels was on his way to the top. I mean, they were still presenting him as like this huge deal in 1995 that it was only going to be a matter of time before Shawn Michaels would win the big one, but not quite there yet. But you could really tell, especially after turning face and losing at WrestleMania 11 to his best friend Diesel. Shawn Michaels ends up becoming like this big baby face, and he would eventually retain the Intercontinental title, get his win back from Razor Ramon. While not as good as WrestleMania 10, but I mean, this match was kind of one of those hidden gems of that particular new generation era, a time where basically wrestling wasn't necessarily at its all-time high in terms of financially and in terms of the creative side of things when we're talking about the booking and just the overall structuring of the shows during this time. But yeah, there was a silver lining, definitely. There was, for every bad thing that the new generation gets, but there's also some good stuff that came out of it as well, and that particularly being the IC title rematch between Shawn and Razor. And then we have his number 8, which will be a year later in 1996, and this would be the Boiler Room Brawl between Undertaker and Mankind. Mankind had just debuted in the company at the time, and they would have a series of matches throughout the early summer of 96 that would eventually escalate into a big match feel here at SummerSlam, being the Boiler Room Brawl. Now, there were some hidden gems as well with Taker and Mankind, and really giving Undertaker like this next big arch nemesis. And he was kind of more of the brains versus the brawn that was the Undertaker. And this particular Boiler Room Brawl would also be the first ever match to be presented as such. And just to see all these guys just go back and forth backstage and a little before they head in the arena, there was just some inventive stuff that they were doing at the time. They were very experimental, and they still haven't really, at that point, found their footing as far as the direction that they want to go with their product. But you could really tell there were some signs that they really want to go into kind of like a more darker direction that they ended up going by the time we get to like 1998. The most infamous moment was towards the end of the match where Paul Bearer, who had been Undertaker's manager from the early years that Taker debuted in the company, and then all of a sudden he just double crosses the Undertaker, aligns himself with Mankind, and just a lot of just something, just this match just really told a really great story, and the match wasn't even that bad either. I guess the only minor nitpick I would say is likely just in terms of like when they were fighting backstage. Like there was always be like some static, or there's just some technical issues as far as when they were brawling backstage, particularly in the boiler rooms. But other than that, there was a lot of good stuff that you can get out of this match, and just the whole match structure about it. I mean, it was just so new at that time. Yeah, I definitely really enjoyed this match, so that would be number 8. Now, number 7 we have is the Steel Cage match, and this is going into 1997, so I'm basically unintentionally bouncing from year to year. And this particular match happens to be the one that opened up the show that year, and that was the cage match between Mankind taking on Triple H. Now, much like the previous countdown on this list, Mankind's also involved, so he and Triple H also had a series of matches as well, and Triple H around this time did, however, beat Mankind in the finals to become the 1997 King of the Ring. But the feud doesn't even end there. So they continue to wrestle at the Canadian Stampede pay-per-view in July, which ends in a double count-out or no finish. So then they ended up having another series of matches, particularly this being a steel cage match. It was a match that basically predates to their epic encounter in 2000, by the time that both guys had been world champions up until that point. But here with Triple H and Mankind, I mean, they were just still trying to find themselves, and they weren't necessarily in that superstar caliber that they would end up being a few years after this. So we have mid card Triple H, we have mid card Mankind just tearing the house down. And you couldn't really tell who was going to win the match. There was just so much suspense. China, did all she can to help out Triple H, and even the ending of the match, like Triple H was going over to the cage door, Mankind was climbing over the cage fence. So it was like, man, you couldn't even tell who's going to get out of the cage first. And obviously, Mankind being the one that barely landed his feet on the ground before Triple H. I mean, especially for a steel cage match, you would think that would be like in the middle of the show, but this one was actually the one that opened up SummerSlam that year, and surprisingly, it was very, very watchable, and definitely enjoyed every bit of it. So that's number 7 there. Now, number 6 is the going back a couple years prior to that, at the very beginning of this decade, as a matter of fact. And this happens to be the tag titles, the 2 out of 3 fall match between Hart Foundation taking on Demolition from SummerSlam 1990. You're going to expect a lot of Bret Hart involved in this from here on out, because the more you realize just how Bret Hart, from year after year after year after year, not only would he be competing at every SummerSlam throughout the 90s, as since being part of the company, but as far as Bret putting on consistently memorable matches and having memorable moments as well. This would be the first out of those many Bret Hart matches that you'll see on this list. So Bret Hart teaming with Jim Neidhart, so they'd be challenging Demolition for those tag titles. This was basically the last hurrah for Demolition, because Demolition had been a popular tag team throughout the late 80s and even going through the early 90s. I mean, this was just months removed from them defeating the Colossal Connection with Andre the Giant and a Haku, which ironically being Andre the Giant's last ever match. And Demolition was really like the hottest tag team in the division at that point. But then you go from that, and then from WrestleMania 6 that year, and then fast forward months later into SummerSlam, all of a sudden they're portrayed as villains. And they did happen to include a third member, being Crush, which would serve as a replacement for one of the original 2 Demolition members. I mean, this match was really the peak of Demolition's popularity, or Demolition's relevance in the WWF, or in terms of being in the tag team division. They got the Legion of Doom to debut in the company around this time, and they both had some as far as Hart Foundation and Demolition's concerned, it was just a really good match. A lot better than their 1988 match. And this one's the one that gets kind of talked about the most. Towards the end, like I would mention about the Legion of Doom, so they played a big part in helping the Hart Foundation win win the tag team title. In some ways it was an end of an era, being that Demolition kind of falls into obscurity, or just kind of declines in popularity after this. And then Hart Foundation would also split up, with Bret Hart enjoying his singles run and Jim Neidhart just kind of basically floundering in the division and the undercard, and teaming up with Owen Hart for a little bit. Yeah, so this was really a pretty historic match, and even if we're looking at in retrospect, I mean, it's just a lot of good stuff. If you haven't checked it out, I suggest you check it out right this instant. And it was really that good. I mean, up until like maybe TLC, the first ever TLC match, I mean, this match was definitely, without a doubt, the best tag team title match of SummerSlam history up until being the next decade. Then we have is number 5. And we're going to take this to 1998. And this happened to be the main event of the show, involving the WWF title being up for grabs. Stone Cold defending the belt against The Undertaker. Now, this was basically a passing of the torch match. So by this point, WWE was really gaining popularity once again, and Stone Cold winning the WWF title that same year, and he would become the number 1 guy in the company up to that point. And also, there was another obstacle that he had to face with The Undertaker. And just the whole build-up just really led to this amazing encounter. And the match obviously wasn't that bad either, but as far as the storytelling is concerned, I mean, the summer, Stone Cold was having his program going on with Mr. McMahon and his thing going on with Dude Love, Mick Foley. So he would move on to his program, Undertaker's brother Kane, and they would have that first blood match where Undertaker comes out there looking to help Stone Cold when he accidentally attacks Stone Cold with the steel chair, causing Stone Cold to lose the WWF title. Now, he would eventually regain it the Raw after King of the Ring. And there was also this little thing going on where Taker and Kane, whether or not they were actually in cahoots once again, which was a whole big time storyline that was going on throughout that summer. Stone Cold and Taker would, however, win the tag team titles from Kane and Mankind. They would continue to hold that belt, those tag titles, for a couple weeks until losing it back to the same team that they won it from. I mean, either way, this match was going to take place regardless, and it was already announced like a month or two in advance that they were going to face each other at SummerSlam that year. So they really hyped it up pretty well, and just the whole video package with AC/DC's Highway to Hell, where we got that infamous Stone Cold walking out of the fire that you would see in the intro credits to Raw's War, or in, like in the music video and all that sort of thing. I mean, everything about this build just had so many moments that kind of left you like, oh my god, I just witnessed all that, and man, I'm just so mind blown by it because it's just that very compelling of that storyline. And we get to SummerSlam 98. I mean, the match was actually very enjoyable. And there was an infamous spot where Taker does that leg drop from the top rope to the announce table. Everything about this match, especially the build up when you factor that in, and just the match itself it was definitely the highlight of the Attitude Era, and definitely the highlight of 1998. And Stone Cold obviously going over The Undertaker to not only retain the WWF title, but also signify that the torch has been passed over. So, being that Undertaker had been a loyal wrestler in the company up to that point, especially at a time when all the top tier wrestlers were either retired or they just went over to the competition. So, Undertaker was basically kind of the number one guy by default. And you have another hot guy like Stone Cold being kind of like a key important wrestler that would contribute to the resurgence in popularity for the WWF. Stone Cold beat The Undertaker to officially signifying that the passing of the torch from the new generation, or the Hulkamania era, how have you, into a brand new wrestler, this hot act being Stone Cold at the time. So I definitely really think that, this match and even the build up just really summarizes just how amazing that is, and that's why I included it in number 5. Now we get to number 4. Now this was a match from the early 90s, and when I was talking about how the countdown list will comprise of a lot of matches involving Bret Hart, this one's a prime example of that. And at number 4 is the IC title match between Bret Hart versus Mr. Perfect from 1991. And this was very amazing because this was just Bret Hart just basically breaking away from the Hart Foundation, venturing out into singles competition. And he would be challenging then Intercontinental Champion Mr. Perfect, who had been holding that belt for the longest time, as far as you could remember. It's interesting also enough that Mr. Perfect was also wrestling Hurt, which is just astounding, but at the same time, it just shows how much guts that, Kurt Hennig had at the time. He and Bret would just go on to have a clinic, and obviously being that Bret Hart did, however, win that match, and really signifying that, Bret Hart's going to be potentially the next top guy for your company. And the IC title was such a workhorse title, just emphasizing more on their athleticism as opposed to their the larger than life personas, the gimmicks. So having someone like Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect being kind of the perfect foil for that mid card division. And I definitely really enjoyed every bit of this particular match, and it would definitely be a sign of things to come for Bret Hart. and he would go on to win the Intercontinental title. And yeah, so this basically laid the groundwork for what would eventually be Bret Hart's rise to the top. Now, at number three, we're going to go back to 1998, and this was also another match from SummerSlam that year that I definitely enjoyed. And this was for the Intercontinental Championship in a ladder match consisting of The Rock defending the belt against Triple H. Now, this was also a huge program that was going on, much like Stone Cold's program with the Brothers of Destruction. But here we have two wrestlers being the leaders of their respective two factions. The Rock being the Nation of Domination, Triple H leading to Generation X. By this point, Shawn Michaels, the original leader of DX, had retired, and he had basically had Triple H come in to pick up the ball, as he quoted the Raw after WrestleMania that year. So he did, in fact, pick up the ball by restructuring DX. He brought back X-Pac, and he got the New Age Outlaws to join D-Generation X as well. And basically, they spent most of the summer feuding with The Rock and his Nation members. And this would lead to some amazing television with DX doing their infamous parody on the Nation of Domination, and especially with Jason Sensation. They will also have a match at Fully Loaded with the 2 out of 3 falls match, which ended in a time limit draw. So that excuse leads us to the next match that they will have being a ladder match. To say that this was a great match would be an understatement, because this was just... the more you think about it, this match kind of brings things full circle, because this was also in the venue where Rock ended up making his debut in Madison Square Garden. And speaking of Madison Square Garden, 4 years prior, we also had the first ever televised ladder match between HBK and Razor, which also involved the Intercontinental title. It's a lot interesting to look back at that in retrospect. And just to see Triple H and Rock, I mean, they weren't necessarily in the main event picture yet, but you could really tell that this match just felt a lot more significant. You could really tell, especially how over, like, The Rock was, and especially how Triple H was at the time, and the crowd was really starting to gravitate towards The Rock towards the end, basically foreshadowing the face turn that he would have for a little bit after this, although he would eventually turn back into the heel with the corporation. But there's just a lot of good stuff here, and just as, Triple H had to wrestle Hurt, which was just unfortunate, but at the same time, he managed to press on, and surprisingly enough, had a really great match. Much like I was saying with Mr. Perfect and Triple H, I mean, it just shows how much guts that these guys had. And I admired those particular athletes for, pulling it through. Like, Triple H was the babyface, Rock was the heel, and I'm so used to the other way around. Like, The Rock's the good guy, Triple H is this arrogant dick that only cares about himself and puts himself over others. And I'm so used to that dynamic that they would have. But here, the initial counter where, like, Triple H is the good guy, Rock's playing the bad guy. I mean, it was just so bizarre just to think about what was going to happen later on in the Attitude Era, where The Rock would be like the most over superstar of the company, and even Triple H was pretty over in his own right as well. I mean, everything about this match really got you thinking, it's like, man, these guys are going to make it to the big leagues, and eventually they did 2 years later. Definitely just such a great match, and that's why I ranked that at number 3. Alright, so number 2 we're going to have is Bret versus Owen. This is the steel cage match for the WF title that they had in 1994. Now, this was a rematch from their WrestleMania 10 encounter, and in WrestleMania 10, Owen Hart up-won Bret Hart, winning his match over his older brother. And Owen would go on to continue that momentum by winning the 1994 King of the Ring, thus granting him a number 1 contender shot against his brother at SummerSlam. So this was just an all-around great match, and it was definitely given a lot of time here, obviously being that this was for the WF title, I mean, the top prestigious belt. I mean, this was a match that didn't require any blood. There wasn't like a whole lot of like spot fest, because I mean, at that time, especially in WWF, you weren't gonna expect like a whole bunch of spot fests. Bret and Owen, I mean, they did all they could. I mean, did basically wrestling in their traditional mat-based wrestling. There was just a lot of suspense. You couldn't tell who's gonna win this match, and they were both interacting in that steel cage. It's just a lot of good stuff. I think there was like a superplex spot off the top of the cage. Like back in those days where they had like those Chuck E. Cheese type of blue cages. I mean, also you also had Roddy Piper there. You also had Jim Neidhart. You had British Bulldog, who also was just returning to the WWE after a short stint in WCW. Just a really all-around great match with a great story to it, and bringing in like the Hart family members, just taking sides in the matter. Like Jim Neidhart actually turned on Bret and sided with Owen at King of the Ring, and British Bulldog coming back to align himself with Bret Hart. So it was kind of like playing fire with fire. Bret Hart did, however, retain the WF title. It's just a really all-around great match. I'm surprised it didn't even close out the show. I mean, they would have at least... The feud would still continue throughout 94 when they brought in Bob Backlund to challenge Bret Hart at Survivor Series, which Bob Backlund won. The feud kind of fizzled out for a bit until they did have one more match, which was like a no-holds-barred match that they had on the Go Home Raw to WrestleMania 11, which I'm kind of surprised they didn't even blow it off on pay-per-view as opposed to like on a random episode of Raw. I mean, especially since Raw wasn't like, even that time, I mean, it wasn't necessarily like this huge, highly rated show until many years later. I mean, the fact that it was just mind-boggling that Bret and Owen didn't have like a proper blow-off on pay-per-view is just beyond me. Nevertheless, I mean, this steel cage match, I definitely really enjoyed every bit out of it, and that's why it's at number 2. And at number 1, I think you might see this from a mile away, and this is from the year of 1992, and we have is the Intercontinental title match between Bret Hart taking on the British Bulldog. This was actually in Wembley Stadium, which was in London, England. Something that is very uncommon for WWE to do was to place this pay-per-view outside of the United States. I mean, granted, we've definitely had that in recent years with Beast from the East and the Greatest Royal Rumble, but those were kind of like house shows. But we're talking about like a big-time pay-per-view event taking place outside of America. But yeah, I mean, just the whole atmosphere of the match. I mean, especially how packed the stadium was, and the fact that Bret Hart was defending the belt against his brother-in-law, British Bulldog, being that this was in his home country. I mean, there was just the whole magnitude about it, just really what helped make this match even better. And the match itself was actually really good, and just the whole atmosphere of it just made it seem like it was WrestleMania. These guys were just tearing the house down, and it was just a hard-fought bout between both guys. British Bulldog did, however, win in his home country, winning the Intercontinental title in the process. This would also be interesting to note that this would be, I believe, the first time at that point, or at least one of the few times that the pay-per-view closed in a match that did not involve the WWF title, especially involving a title belt that wasn't the world title. I should clarify that. And just to see someone like, with these two wrestlers that weren't necessarily main eventers at that point. I mean, Bret Hart was still kind of on the verge of a main event position, but British Bulldog, I mean, was, they were both still undercards. But Bulldog getting kind of like that big defining moment of his entire wrestling career, just to kind of have him close out a pay-per-view in front of a capacity crowd of people, especially given that this was in his home country. I mean, it was just, must have been an amazing, just a breathtaking experience. British Bulldog with, Davey Boy Smith winning that IC title, and just everything about that match. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you check it out. Maybe on the WWE Network, or check it whatever video streaming website you could find. I mean, it was just that damn good of a match, if not even greater. It's just unfortunate that British Bulldog is no longer here with us. Bret Hart, I mean, he's, he would go on to have his success in the main event scene and winning the WWF title not long after this pay-per-view. When we were talking about SummerSlam, I mean, Bret Hart definitely being Mr. SummerSlam like HBK is to Mr. WrestleMania. That's basically my number one list, and that's basically my top 10 favorite SummerSlam matches of the 1990s. So feel free to comment down in the comment section below. Just tell me which were some of your favorite SummerSlam matches. Do you agree with this list, or are there other big time matches that you feel should have been included on the list? So feel free to comment in the comment section below. Thank you all guys for watching. Stay tuned as I will conduct my top 10 favorite SummerSlam matches of the 2000s. So stick around for that. And until next time, this is the Gold Standard 00924 signing out.